environment is predictable. All right, what about in terms of clutch size or litter size? So for our selected species, they produce many offspring at one time. So because adult mortality is high, individuals who save energy to reproduce more later will, again, probably die before they have a chance to do that. So they're going to have few, if any, offspring. Adult survival is just too risky and unpredictable in this unpredictable environment. So they, just throw all their offspring out there at one time, right? So produce many offspring at a time because mortality is high. Mortality of those adults is high. So individuals who save energy to reproduce later, that's a waste, right? Because they might die before they even reproduce, or maybe they'll have fewer offspring at all. Okay, so again, adult survival is just too risky to wait. On the other hand, for case-selected species, they produce a few offspring at a time because producing many offspring, again, would require too much energy. So this is also what was brought up, right? Producing many offspring will require producing small offspring who wouldn't be competitive. Again, bigger is better, right? Bigger, more competitive offspring who can survive in this environment where populations are at carrying capacity. Bigger is better. And remembering, of course, that there's that trade-off. So if they're going to have just a few offspring, or if they're going to have big offspring, they can only have a few offspring, right? Energy for reproduction is finite. So few large versus many small. So in this case, a few large offspring. All right, so related to that, you can see these are all intertwined. Offspring size, then, you should be able to predict already what this is going to look like. So for our selected species, they produce small offspring because they're producing a whole bunch of offspring at a time, right? So they produce small offspring because producing large offspring would reduce the number that they could produce. So again, that trade-off comes up again, right? These things are all very related to each other. So there's finite energy that can be invested into reproduction. So for these our selected species, they want to maximize the number of offspring, as many as they possibly can, which means they will have to be small offspring because of that trade-off, right? Energy is finite for reproduction. On the other hand, for the case-selected species, they're going to produce large offspring, right? Because small offspring would not survive as well in this highly competitive environment, right? So a few large offspring. Again, like I said, there's lots of overlap. I'm just trying to break it down bit by bit so you can see how it plays out. Again, the idea that bigger is better for those case-selected species. Okay, and so then again, related to that idea is the reproductive strategy. And this is the idea of putting all your eggs in one basket, just one time, or producing a few eggs in a few baskets over a long period of time. Okay, so for the R-selected species, they put all their eggs in one basket at one time, and that's called semelparous, right? They have all their offspring at one time. And this will evolve again because individuals who save energy to reproduce later are probably going to die before they reproduce because of this density independent, crazy, unpredictable environment. So overall, they're just going to produce as many offspring as they possibly can at once with hopes of having some be successful, right? So it's an all or nothing type of strategy. And so the classic example that's always given here is salmon, right? They run up their freshwater streams and they produce all their offspring and then they die. Sort of the classic example of that semelparous strategy. Okay, and in case-selected species then, instead it's an iteroparous strategy. This means that they have many reproductive bouts over their lifetime, not just one. Okay, and this will evolve because individuals can only have a few offspring at a time, right? We said they can have a few big offspring at a time because they need to make them large and competitive. So having to, the ability to produce multiple offspring then means there have to be multiple reproductive bouts over the lifetime. Okay, so to have many offspring requires having them over many different reproductive events, many different reproductive seasons. Okay, and so the classic example here are elephants, and this is what the speaker said in the crash course video that we watched during the last lab. Okay, and then of course related to that is body size, is the adult body size. So for our selected species, the adults tend to be small because they reproduce as early as they possibly can. They don't wait till they're a bigger body size. They just reproduce as soon as they possibly can, because if they wait until they're bigger, they might die before they reproduce at all, which means zero fitness, right? So they do not delay maturity. They sort of get to the minimum adult size they need to possibly be before they can start producing offspring. And of course, for K-selected species, it's different because now it's the driving force is to be bigger is better, to be competitive at carrying capacity. So they're large adults, so they can produce large competitive offspring. And again, back to that positive relationship between adult body size and offspring size. Bigger adults can produce bigger offspring. And again, the bigger is better. This is kind of the underlying principle in this K-selected idea. Okay, so again, that's going through sort of each of those life history traits and talking about how they might look between R and K-selected species. And again, there's lots of overlap in those arguments, but teasing it apart like that. And then here now is a sort of synthesis summarizing those traits side by side. So again, in an unpredictable environment, right, we expect this R-selected strategy. And I've put in the text here, they have a fast life history. In contrast to in predictable environments where we have K-selected species, and I call this a slow life history. So those are my words. I've seen that type of terminology used in the literature as well, but I think it helps for me a lot to understand what's happening, to call it fast versus slow. Okay, so for those R-selected species, there's a small body size, they have fast development, they're fairly short-lived, and they reproduce early in life, have a whole bunch of small offspring with fast population growth rates, typically no parental care, which is not something I explicitly talked about, but it's listed here. And they have weak competitive ability because that's not the point, right? The point is to reproduce as soon as possible. These populations do not get to carrying capacity, right? So variable population size is often well below carrying capacity. And they live in these variable and unpredictable, unpredictable mortality environments. So the environment is unpredictable, which means that mortality of adults is variable and unpredictable, okay? In contrast, in the predictable environment, we have these K-selected species that have a slow life history. So we have a large body size, slow development, so there's a delay in maturity. They tend to be long-lived. They reproduce later in life, so they delay reproduction. They have a few large offspring at a time, but they do that multiple times over their life. Tend to have slow population growth rates, slow and predictable, right? They tend to have parental care because they're having a few large offspring that they're going to take good care of to make sure that they're competitive, right? That strong competitive ability. Tend to have constant population sizes that are close to carrying capacity, right? And so they have more constant mortality that's also predictable. Okay. So there it is in sort of a nutshell. And so how have these ideas been applied sort of in ecological theory? So there's two general ways that this RK selection model has been applied. The first is to look at large groups of species that have been categorized. So you can categorize large groups of species as R-selected or K-selected. So for example, some have said that insects are more R-selected, whereas mammals are more K-selected. So these big groups of organisms, these big taxonomic level groups. Okay, so the problem with this idea is that there are other reasons for differences between species, right? Besides variability or constancy in the environment, right? So that, again, this RK selection model is based on these environmental variables, this predictable environment versus unpredictable environment. But there's other reasons besides environment that could contribute to the different life history parameters, right? Not all insects live in unpredictable environments. So making that blanket statement is maybe not that great. Insects might be small because they have an exoskeleton as opposed to an internal skeleton, right? So that's going to be an important factor. Mammals, they can't be that small because they're endotherms, so that's not going to work for them necessarily. So, again, it sets a framework for doing some comparisons, but there's holes in how well you can apply that sort of blanket statement. Another way that it's been applied is a closely related species, or maybe populations of a species have been categorized as sort of more of a relative scale, like a sliding scale. Something is relatively more R or K selected rather than definitively R or K selected. Okay, so the way this is kind of a neat way to apply it, because close relatives, like closely related species, are likely to be similar in a lot of ways, and so this allows a better testing of whether or not differences in life history are really reflecting differences in environment, right? So we're kind of controlling for those other things that I said argue against this first application of the theory, right? So an example here would be these for mice, for deer mice. So Peromyscus maniculatus versus Peromyscus leucopus, right? So these are related species of the same genus. And so we can look, because they're related, we, again, have taken care of these broad blanket taxonomic comparisons. Things are controlled for there. But we can look at where these two species live, and we can make some inferences about life history here. So maniculatus, for example, Peromyscus maniculatus, that's who's pictured here, they tend to live in variable environments relative to leucopus, which tend to live in more stable environments. Maniculatus has a higher litter size, smaller babies, and an early age at maturity. So it's following this sort of more R-selected strategy. Leucopus, they tend to live in relatively more stable environments. They have smaller litter sizes and larger babies and a later age at maturity. So they're relatively more K-like, right? So that's in my mind, that's a more valuable comparison. Of course, if you compare even within species, like across latitude, which is what I'm interested in doing, then you even control for more of these other factors. But again, so maniculatus, it lives in a more variable environment, and so you would expect more R-selected traits. And indeed, that's what you see compared to leucopus, which lives in more stable environments where you would expect to see more K-like selected factors. And indeed, when you make those comparisons, that's kind of how it pans out. So that's an interesting way to apply that RK selection model. Well, that's not the end of the story. There's a third strategy that's been applied. So some species don't fit those RK selection ideas very, very well. So for example, herring, which is pictured here, herring live in an unpredictable variable environment, but they're long-lived in Iteroparis. So we have this weird mixing of things, right? So we have, that variable, unpredictable environment, then you would expect R-selected type traits. But instead, herring tend to have more K-selected types of traits, right? They're long-lived and they're Iteroparis and they're large-bodied. So how do you explain that? So this species like herring and turtles also show that the RK selection model doesn't tell the whole story. There's more going on. It's not a complete story. So this third life history strategy has been proposed, which is called Bet-hedging. And so this is predicted in environments that have unpredictable disturbances that increase mortality of young, but that don't affect the adults. So for the adults, things are more stable. For the young, things are very unstable, unpredictable. So you can, these types of disturbances, you can think of them being sort of pretty common, right? Because in general, young individuals tend to be more susceptible to losses and mortality and things that might, environmental factors that might make them more vulnerable. So this idea, this bet-hedging idea then refers to avoiding the risk of losing all of your young. So if you produced all your young at once and it turned out to be a bad year, right, you can avoid that risk by reproducing a few young over many different years. So iteroparity is one of the characteristics of bet-hedging species, as I already said for herring, right? But you end up with these characteristics that are similar to what you expect for K selection, but the reasoning is different. It's not because we're at carrying capacity. It's not because these animals are at population sizes approaching carrying capacity where bigger is better for that competitive reason. Instead, it's because the environment has this sort of two ways that it's impacting the life stages. There's this high mortality, high unpredictable mortality of young, but stable, predictable mortality that's low for the adults, okay? So again, you end up with characters like K-selected species, large body size, iteroparity, but it's not because of that carrying capacity competitiveness, okay? So bet-hedgers are not at carrying capacity. So if we see like groups of species or populations in which, there's some more iteroparous, larger individuals that have a few offspring at a time, it could be because of this K selection idea, or it could be because of this bet-hedging idea. And so again, just to sort of where this idea of the term bet-hedging comes from this idea of, for me, an example that makes sense is horse races, right? So if you want to hedge your bets, literally, right, you would bet a little bit of money on every one of these horses rather than putting all your money on one horse who might end up being this loser back here. But if you put a few dollars on every single horse, you're guaranteed to win something in the end, right? So you're hedging your bets by spreading out your investment across multiple individuals. So it's a similar idea to how the wording for Bet-hedging life history evolves. So for like the herring that do this, that interoperity, a few offspring every time over a long period of time, in an evolutionary context, then there's going to be a payoff at some point, right? You can have losses and losses, but there will be a payoff. So you don't invest everything at once, you spread your investment, you hedge your bets. So that's where that name comes from. Okay, so again, what are the features of these guys? So again, it's similar to what K-selected species have. They're long-lived, they have delayed sexual maturity, they're interoperous, but here's the difference. They have high unpredictable egg and juvenile mortality, but low predictable adult mortality. So we have this difference happening across the life stages, right? So, and I've got this picture of a turtle here because this is the life history strategy that has been applied to turtles because their populations tend to not be at carrying capacity. So that's how that's been applied. Okay, so 3 life history strategies: R-selected, K-selected, and Bet-hedgers. Okay, but there's yet even more to the story. So the models that I've talked about so far, those 3 models, they are evolutionary models, right? And they predict that differences that we see in these life history traits are evolved genetic differences, like driven by genetics, right? But there's an alternative hypothesis to how that might work. And it's that life history traits instead show plasticity, phenotypic plasticity. They're malleable, they can change, plastic. This occurs when there are different possible life history responses to different situations, right? So phenotypic plasticity is the ability of an individual to alter its physiology, its morphology, its behavior in response to a change in environmental conditions. So it refers to the ability of genetically identical organisms to alter their phenotype in response to the environment. Okay, so ability of an individual to alter its physiology, morphology, behavior, whatever it is, in response to a change in environmental conditions. So again, it's a single genotype that can have different phenotypic outcomes depending on the environment that it's exposed to. Okay, so it's plastic, right? The phenotype is plastic. So for example, in a good year, individuals might have more offspring, and in a bad year, they might have fewer offspring. So clutch size is not fixed, it's plastic, right? So a larger clutch size in a good year, and hopefully those offspring all survive. Another one you can think of, if we think about insects and timing of diapause. In a bad year, there's an insect that has one genetic code, but if that insect is exposed to really horrible environmental conditions, it may go into diapause. If it's exposed to really good environmental conditions, it may skip diapause and instead reproduce, for example, right? So it's a response to environmental conditions. So differences among species or populations might not be genetic. They may reflect these phenotypic responses to different environmental conditions. And so when you think about that, take it a step further and think about phenotypic plasticity, it could be then really advantageous, right? It could allow individuals to take advantage of different environmental conditions rather than having some, genetically determined thing that has to happen no matter what. This genetically inflexible life history. So in that regard, then phenotypic plasticity itself is adaptive, right? This plasticity is an adaptation to deal with variable environmental conditions. So there's a way to test whether or not a life history trait you see is a plastic trait or a fixed genetic life history trait. So is it a phenotypically plastic trait or is it a fixed genetically trait? And there's a couple of ways that this can be done in an experimental fashion. So there's common garden experiments and then reciprocal transplant experiments to test whether those traits are fixed or plastic. So I'll give an example of a reciprocal transplant, for example. So this idea, so say you're trying to test whether or not body size at maturity. So size at maturity, you want to know if that life history trait is plastic or if it's fixed. So then what you could do, so say you have a latitudinal gradient in body size of some organism. Let's take crickets. So you have crickets that have a large body size in the cold north and have a small body size in the cool south. And so you go to the wild and you collect those crickets and you would then do a reciprocal transplant in the lab. So you take northern big crickets and you put them in an incubator where they're exposed to southern conditions. You take southern crickets and you expose them to conditions that are northern. So, lower photo period, colder conditions, more seasonality. And then you also have a control, right? You put northern crickets in northern conditions, you put southern crickets in southern conditions. And so if it is a plastic trait, then the offspring of those transplanted individuals will end up looking like the ones that are native from that place, right? So if you take a northern cricket and you move it to a southern environment, if the offspring that are produced are having traits of the southern individuals, that tells you that the trait is plastic because the environment has shaped those conditions. Now, if you take that northern cricket and put it in southern conditions and its offspring retain those northern features, that is the bigger body size, the delayed body size, then you know it's a genetically fixed life history trait, okay? So think about that. And this example that I've given you, it actually is exactly an example from work that my PhD supervisor did. He worked with striped ground crickets, and he did these phenotypic plasticity transplant experiments to figure out if their life history traits were fixed or plastic. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And think about what you would expect to see if it's a fixed genetic life history trait versus if it's a plastic trait. What would happen if you did these reciprocal transplants, keeping in mind that you have to have a control to make an appropriate comparison. Okay. So then another idea here are these things called reaction norms, which are properties of that genotype, right? Remember I said that for phenotypic plasticity, there's a single genotype, but the phenotypes can differ depending on the exposure to the environment. So this reaction norm, then, this is the property of a genotype. So it's the set of phenotypes into which a single genotype can be mapped with that variation in the environment. So one genotype can produce a range of phenotypes depending on the environment that's encountered. So traits are functions of genes and the environment. It's a combination, right? So here's a simple graphic to show you how this might look. So on the x-axis, we have an environmental gradient. Maybe it's temperature, whatever, it's rainfall, whatever it might be, but we have low to high. And then we have whatever the phenotypic trait is here. Age at maturity, size at maturity, just adult body size, whatever it might be, right? Or clutch size. And then we have the yellow line here. This is the reaction norm. So this shows you at the low end of the environmental gradient, cool temperatures, the trait is this manifestation. The phenotype looks like this. If you go moving to, say, temperature, again, the hottest end of things, and then this is the trait of the phenotype. This is how that phenotype looks here. So again, it's a single genotype. This organism that we've exposed to this environmental gradient, it has a single genotype. But the phenotype has this range of possibilities in how it might look depending on what environment it's been exposed to, okay? So this reaction norm, this is a plot. This is a graph that is a visual description of the contributions of genes and environment to that phenotype, okay? So the reaction norm is the graph that shows this relationship between genotype and environment, okay? So just some more examples of how these reaction norms could be applied. So you can have, it's shown as like one reaction norm. So the example here, the environmental gradient is temperature and the life history trait is size at maturity. And you have one reaction norm to show what that might look like. So at cool temperatures, size at maturity is big, it's up here. At warmer temperatures, size at maturity is here, it's smaller, okay? And again, this is a single genotype that's mapping for these various phenotypes. You might also do it as you look at all the individuals. So the dotted lines would be all the individuals in that population, and then you can calculate a population mean to get a mean reaction norm for that population. And so just to sort of apply it one step further using the spotted turtle example that I gave you earlier, looking at age at maturity, or size at maturity was the example I gave, or overall adult body size was an example I gave in an earlier lecture. So it's this idea. So we know that both age and size at maturity in spotted turtles do differ with latitude. So again, temperature, latitude being a proxy for temperature, right? So age at maturity is delayed in cooler environments versus age at maturity in warmer environments. Okay, so it's indicating a plasticity to that trait. But to be able to say that for sure, right, you would have to rear populations in captivity and look at subsequent generations to see if this is truly a plastic or a fixed trait. Okay, So reaction norms also tell us some more stuff. They tell us about how plastic a genotype is. So the slope of the reaction norm expresses the plasticity of that phenotype. So shallow slopes, like this one, a shallow slope means something is less plastic. So the organism is less sensitive to environmental variation. So the genotype is coding for fewer phenotypes, right? So here's the phenotypic trait, right? So if we look at the top versus the bottom end of that line, the phenotypic variation is only like this much, right? Whereas if we look at this example, we have quite a very plastic situation, right? So when you have a steep slope like this means that the trait is more plastic. The organism is more sensitive to the environment. Lots of different phenotypes can result. So we do the same thing if we extrapolate the ends of this line to the y-axis, which is the phenotype. The phenotype can range for this manifestation all the way up to this manifestation, right? Lots of different possibilities for that phenotype for how it could look. So we say that's very plastic, it's very sensitive. Well, then you could also ask, are these phenotypes, endlessly, boundlessly plastic? And well, the answer is no, of course, because there are some very ancient evolutionary mechanisms by which development happens, right? The large-scale structure of the organism is determined by pretty hard to change developmental patterns that have a very deep evolutionary history. Like, basic developmental patterns are 500 to 600 million years old. So you can't shift those very easily. So, these ancient developmental genes, they then, make somewhat of a rigid framework for how plastic something is going to be, right? And these are graphs that I drew just to explain the difference between not very plastic and quite plastic. But keep in mind that there's not this endless plasticity because of, again, ancient developmental pathways, 500 to 600 million years old, that are going to put some barriers on how plastic that could be. Okay. All right. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. So we talked about these life history strategies, right? We talked about R-selected, K-selected, and Bet-hedging. And then we talked about life history traits being genetically fixed versus plastic, and that reaction norms are the graphical way to represent that plasticity. But there's more to the story that we can talk about that has to do with this reproductive part. That's a big piece of this idea of life histories. So we're going to talk about reproductive effort. And so this addresses the question about how much should an animal invest in any given act of reproduction, in any given reproductive bout. And so there's going to be both proximate and ultimate factors that play a role here. We've talked about these before. So proximate factors, those are the physiological sort of immediate mechanisms, right? And then the ultimate factor, these are circumstances of the life history and the environment. These are the bigger picture evolutionary things. So there's going to be proximate and ultimate factors that determine the allocation of resources into reproduction versus non-reproduction activities, right? So again, it all ties together back to that idea of an ecological energy budget, and then a piece of that goes to production, and within that production is reproduction, and then within that, there's also finite amounts of energy, right? So again, there's going to be proximate and ultimate factors that are going to determine the allocation of resources into reproduction versus non-reproductive things, right? So reproductive effort is the proportion of an organism's total energy budget, then, that ecological energy budget that's devoted to reproductive activities rather than into growth and survival, right? So if they're bigger, they're probably going to survive better. So there's that trade-off, right? So reproductive effort, that's how much of that energy budget goes into reproductive activities. Recognizing that means it's going to take away energy from growth and survival. Okay. So how much should an animal invest? Well, selection for high levels of reproductive effort are predicted to occur under these different scenarios. So when the extrinsic, that is the external, originating from outside, right? So when the extrinsic adult mortality is high, that's when there should be high levels of reproductive effort. So you can think about this, it relates back to that idea of an R-selected species. If you're not going to, if this extrinsic adult mortality is high and it's unpredictable because the environment is really unpredictable and you have these density independent factors happening, then again, it's, you might as well just reproduce as much as you possibly can, right? So selection for high levels of reproductive effort. And there's this idea that's been proposed by George Williams, who is a more recent evolutionary, Darwin originally, and then Williams is sort of a more recent evolutionary biology thinker. And he coined this phrase called the terminal investment hypothesis, which predicts that individuals should invest more in their current reproduction if they don't think they're going to live into the future again. So right back to that R-selected idea. So terminal investment, this is it. It's terminal. It's the end. Put all that you can into that reproductive effort, right? So that's that idea of when extrinsic adult mortality is high, that selects for high reproductive effort. There's also an idea that there should be high reproductive effort when in environments where there's a constant juvenile survivorship, because then there's a good payoff. If the juveniles are going to survive well, then go ahead and invest in those, right? That's a good investment on your return. So in environments with high juvenile survivorship, there's a high payoff for the effort. So there will be a selective advantage to a high reproductive effort. And then also on a sort of shorter scale, in good years for juvenile survivorship, when you have a typically variable environment, that it would be worthwhile to invest a lot in reproduction. It's sort of related to that idea where juvenile survivorship might be good. So then you should invest a bunch. Okay, and then there's this idea of reproductive value. So reproductive effort is the amount of your energy budget that goes into reproduction. But then there's also this idea of reproductive value, which we touched on to some degree when we talked about life tables. So to maximize its overall lifetime contribution to future generations, an animal should weigh the profits of its immediate prospects of reproductive success against its long-term future prospects. And this goes back to, again, that idea of a lac clutch, right? And we talked about some of those trade-offs of optimal clutch size, right? Because the energy that's invested now, that means there's less energy for the future. So there has to be, natural selection is going to favor the optimal amount of investment to ensure current success and having some future success, right? So again, to maximize the overall lifetime contribution to future generations, an animal should weigh the profits of its immediate prospects of reproductive success against the costs to the long-term future prospects. Okay, so an individual with a high probability of future reproduction should be more hesitant to risk everything in present reproduction, right? That's kind of more of a case-selected idea than another individual who has a low probability of reproducing successfully in the future, right? That's that R-selected idea. Okay, so again, an individual that has a high probability of future reproductive success should be, there's no point in risking everything right now into reproductive activities, that more case-selected idea. Versus another individual who might have a lower probability of reproducing successfully in the future. That would be that R-selected individual. That individual should invest more now in its current reproduction. So in addition, present reproduction, as I already said, it's going to decrease the expectation of future reproduction, right? Because again, the energy you invest now means less for the future in this sort of lifetime aspect of looking at reproductive success. So this brings up this idea of reproductive value, right? This age-specific expectation of all future offspring. This idea was coined by Fisher in 1930, one of the other famous evolutionary thinkers, like Williams and some of the others that like Dobzhansky, others that I mentioned earlier in the course. Okay, so again, this reproductive value is the age-specific expectation of all future offspring. So this again goes back to the idea of the life table data that we were looking at, right? So here, the reproductive effort, that piece of the pie chart, at a given age will be selected to maximize the reproductive value. So whatever reproductive investment is given now or at a given age, it's going to be selected to maximize that overall lifetime success, that reproductive value. Because what you invest now, again, means less for later. So we have a graphic here from the ecology textbook that tries to explain how this is happening. So the blue line, this is present reproductive success, this capital P, right? So it's assumed to increase, but with diminishing returns. It's not a linear line, it's a flattening out line, right? It's reaching a sort of asymptote. So present reproductive success is assumed to increase, but with diminishing returns based on the present investment. Whereas future reproductive success, this is the orange line, right? It declines with present investment, right? So as you invest now, there's less and less for the future, which I've said a few times, okay? So then you put those two together, you add P and F together, you add present reproductive success to future reproductive success, and you get this green line, which is lifetime reproductive success, right? Putting together the present and the future, okay? So this is lifetime reproductive success. It's that present versus future reproductive success, okay? And so this is the sum then, P plus F, right? It's the sum of those two things. And so then the optimal level of investment, I, right, present investment. So the optimal level of investment is at that high point for that P plus F line. So what you should invest now, is honed by this maximum lifetime reproductive success. So that's how the theory plays out, right? So the optimal level of present investment, this I value, is that which brings about the maximum lifetime reproductive success. Again, based on this combination of present and future. Okay? So that's how that is categorized. So here's some real data that support that. This is data on rotifers. Specifically looking here, so age-specific fecundity versus residual reproductive value, right? So as age-specific fecundity is increasing, there's a decrease in what remains of the reproductive value, right? So as you invest now, there's less for later. So that just shows that with real data supporting that idea of reproductive value. So current investment in reproduction should vary inversely with expectation of future offspring, right? And you can see the survival aspect of that as well here, okay? So some real data to show how that looks. Okay, we have another example from the ecology textbook here, another couple of examples. The first one using cactus ground finches and then the other one using red deer. So here's a comparison here. The top one again is the cactus ground finch, and the males are shown with this purple line and the females are shown with this orange line. And so the y-axis here, this Vx, this is reproductive value against age is what's shown here. So the reproductive, there's a couple things you can get out of this graphic. The first is that the reproductive value of females is higher than that of males, right? The females are producing offspring, so that's partly where that comes from, okay? And the other thing you can see from this is that, generally the reproductive value increases for both sexes to a peak, and then it drops off, right, with age. So there's this sort of peak reproductive period here at this age, and then it declines, right? So reproductive values are higher for females than males, and generally the reproductive values rise to a peak for both sexes at an early age and then decline. So another aspect that's not shown here explicitly is that the reproductive values for these cactus ground finches is also related to annual variation in rainfall. So there's an environmental factor here as well. But generally, you can really see it's a pretty clear pattern. If we look at, so that's how it works in this bird species. If we look at how it works in these red deer, now we again have both sexes separated for their reproductive values. And the way this was calculated, the reproductive value here was calculated in terms of the number of female offspring surviving to 1 year of age. So that's how that was estimated. So the blue line here, these are the females, the hinds, and then the purple line, this is the males or the stags. And you can see that the shape is different. So for these cactus ground finches, the shapes were very similar, but the female was higher than the male. In this case, the height is similar, but the shape of the curves is different. So the reproductive value of females, it declines gradually from about 4 years of age, right? So the peak reproductive value is like 3 to 4 years old, and then there's a gradual decline, fairly linear over time with age for those females. And this decline reflects the physiological drain of reproduction, right? That's why it gets lower. For the males, you can see that there's this increase, but then there's this level of high reproductive value for some period of time, like 3 to 7 years of age. It's pretty constant there, but then it drops rather precipitously compared to the females. And that drop for the males, this is the loss of vigor after several years of very intense reproductive activity. So this intense reproductive activity, and then basically they're just worn out. And so they have this fairly steep decline in reproductive value at about 7 years, starting at about 7 years of age. Okay. All right. So Jen, we're going to review all the things that we talked about today. So this idea of life history theory. So life history, this is the suite of coevolved characteristics or traits that are directly influencing population parameters, such as population growth. And this is why we can connect this idea of life history traits back to those life tables, because we can use the data in life tables to make some projections about population growth over time, right? So again, the characteristics that we call life history characters, these are like age-specific survivorship, age-specific reproductive output, age and size at maturity, longevity, semelparous versus iteroparous reproductive strategies. Those are all things that we would put under as listed in these coevolved characteristics, right? And coevolved means they're evolving together. And that's why when I was talking about the individual things, I wasn't really totally separating them because they all sort of hinge on each other, right? Now, the thing that's super important to remember about this again is that the selective force here is the environment. So under this theory of RK selection, right, the selective force that's here is the environment. And the RK selection models have to do with how unpredictable environments versus predictable environments might influence and shape these life history characteristics, right? So remembering that for an R-selected species, what kind of environment do you expect to see shaping these R-selected traits? What kind of environment shapes an R strategy? Anybody? Somebody can say it or put it in the chat.
An unpredictable environment.
Right. So if it's an unpredictable environment, continue on. So if it's an unpredictable environment, what kind of traits are you going to see?
So higher death rates of adults, because like say there might be like more natural disasters there. So more adults are going to get wiped out at one point instead of a natural kind of death rate.
Right. So we're going to see R-selected traits in unpredictable environments where adult mortality is unpredictable and high, right? And so then in that case, the strategy is reproduce as soon as you possibly can and get as many kids out there in the environment as soon as you possibly can, because you're probably going to die. So if you want to have any kind of fitness, hurry up and reproduce, right? And that's what we expect in these unpredictable environments. Okay, so then what kind of environment shapes a K selection? And what would that look like? Anybody?
So a more constant environment, so like more constant resources, constant rainfall, so it's more predictable. So that way, like, sorry, I don't know if I'm explaining this properly.
Yeah. So where does the K come from? So you're right, it's a predictable environment. So why do we call it a K selection model then?
Well, because the environment is so predictable, it has so many resources, it's able to support, there's more individuals, so they're getting close to carrying capacity.
Right. And the thing that plays a big role at carrying capacity is competitive advantage, right? To be big and strong, bigger is better. So in these predictable environments where populations are going to go up to carrying capacity, then we're going to expect traits that make individuals more competitive. And this tends to be big and strong, right? So a few large offspring with some parental care to make sure those kids make it, because things are pretty competitive. So Samantha, thank you for that. So keeping in mind, you made a comment about resources, and that's true, of course, when a population is growing. But once you get at carrying capacity, now there's some competition for those resources, right? So it's a stable environment, allows populations to grow, and there's lots of resources initially. But then once you get to carrying capacity now, right, those resources are in short supply, and so there's lots of competition. So organisms tend to evolve these slow life history traits where they delay maturity to a bigger size and a later age, because when they do that, they can have bigger, more competitively successful offspring, right? So again, in this In these unpredictable environments, we expect these R selection strategies. That little r, that's the per capita growth rate. That has to do with reproduction, right? That little r from the logistic growth model. So we favor these R strategists in these unpredictable environments, which is fast life history. Grow up as soon as you possibly can and get all your kids out there as soon as you possibly can, because you're probably going to die. Versus in a predictable environment, if we go back to that logistic growth model, it's K for carrying capacity, because those populations are slow and steady wins the race kind of idea. They grow to carrying capacity. And so the traits that evolve under those conditions are going to be traits for big, strong, competitive individuals. Okay. All right. So again, also thinking about that, for the R selected species, we have density independent factors playing a role. And for the K selected species, we have density dependent factors playing a role, because now populations are getting to carrying capacity. Okay. So that's how that plays out. But then there's this third strategy, this bed-hedging strategy. And here it's a little different, because there's still things happening in the environment, but they the environment differentially affects different age classes. So for the bed-hedgers, there's this unpredictable juvenile mortality from the environment, but there's this more predictable adult mortality that tends to be quite low. So you end up evolving traits that look similar to those of a K-selected species, but for different reasons. In the K-selected species, again, the driving force are these density-dependent factors that operate at carrying capacity. But for the bet-hedging species, instead, it's this idea of hedging your bets and putting a little bit out there every year, because your kids are unpredictable. Your survivorship of your kids is unpredictable. So you keep putting a few more out there every year. So you're interoperous, but it's not because you're trying to make those kids competitive over the long term because it's at carrying capacity. It's because they might die this year, next year, and next year, but then maybe that year they're going to survive. So you keep producing a few every year and have this interoperous strategy, because you as an adult, you have a predictable survivorship and great longevity. You're going to live for a long time. So you can hedge your bets, right? It's like the horse races example that I gave. Okay. So again, these populations are not at carrying capacity, so we don't call it K-selected. But again, the traits that evolve in these species can look quite similar to those of a K-selected species. So you have to think about the environment, again, shaping these three strategies, these three life history strategies. Okay. And then there's this idea of phenotypic plasticity, right? So this is the idea that, so those three life history strategies that I talked about, the sort of underlying idea there is that these are fixed genetic traits, that age at maturity is a fixed genetic trait, and that size at maturity is a fixed genetic trait, etc. But for phenotypic plasticity now, the idea is that a single genotype can actually map onto various phenotypes depending on what that genotype experiences in the environment, right? So again, it's basically different phenotypic manifestations of a single genotype based on exposure to different environmental conditions, right? The ability of genetically identical individuals to have an altered phenotype, whether again it's morphology or physiology or behavior, that's in response to the environment. And again, a key factor about this idea of phenotypic plasticity is that the plasticity itself is an adaptation. It's advantageous, right? Because if you can be plastic and sort of exploit these different environmental conditions to your advantage, well, then you're going to have higher fitness, right? And something really important to keep in mind, and I hope it sort of came up when I was talking about the reciprocal transplant experiment idea, is that it's not that an individual over their individual lifetime is plastic, right? So it's not like, one individual cricket can change its phenotype during its lifetime. It can't be small early in its life and then large later in its life at adult. It's the next generation, right? It's what happens over generations. Okay, so keep that in mind, right? It's not that an individual, if you think about the peppered moth idea as an example, right? The population changed over time. It's not that one individual moth was black and then it became white. Okay, the individual couldn't change its phenotype. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And then reaction norms. This is a graphical way to represent phenotypic plasticity. So reaction norms are a way to graphically plot the range of possible phenotypes in response to environment of a single genotype, right? So again, reaction norm, this is the graph. that shows phenotypic plasticity. So it's showing the possible phenotypes in response to the environment that a single genotype can have. Okay, again, a single genotype with multiple phenotypic responses depending on environment. We graph that in a reaction norm. Okay. Now we talked about reproductive effort and value. So reproductive effort, this is the allocation of resources from that ecological energy budget to reproduction, right? That's the effort. But then reproductive value, right? That's the age-specific expectation of all the future offspring. And we said it decreases with age, right? So the energy that you put into reproduction now means you're going to have less energy in the future over your lifetime because it's expensive to produce and take care of kids. So what you invest now means less later. And again, when you look back at your life table data in the M column, you can see that that fecundity value, starts out low and then it gets higher and then it goes low again. And so we looked at that also in terms of those cactus ground finches, and we looked at it in terms of the red deer, right? That there's this change in reproductive value with age. And then we also looked at the graphic that compares present and future reproduction and sort of where the optimal is of what an individual should invest in presently, considering those trade-offs in energy between now and later to achieve the best overall reproductive output over the lifetime. And that is everything for today's lecture. So I will stop sharing and go over to the chat to see if there's things we can talk about. Let's see. So Cameron's got a question. How is it that animals have an overall finite amount of energy when they can replenish it by consuming? Oh, that's such a good question. So I think the way to consider it is that you can argue it, I guess, on different timescales. It is definitely true that organisms can acquire more energy, but even still, when they acquire that more energy, they still have to partition that pie into what they're going to invest, right? And when we looked at like the mottled rattlesnake example, right, depending on different productivities of environments, there can be an overall bigger pie or an overall smaller pie. So that can still happen, but the pie is still a pie, right? And so what's happening with that current amount of energy is still have to be partitioned there. So hopefully that answers your question, Cameron. I also put a note there in the chat just to tell everybody again, there is no lab today. Today is your Zoom fatigue break day, but your results and discussion assignment is still due during today's lab period. So by 3:50 p.m. today, your results and discussion is due. Are there any other questions about life history strategies for experiments to examine a plastic or fixed trait? What is an example of a common garden experiment? Okay, so that's a great question, Janine. So for a common garden, so I talked about reciprocal transplant where you actually take something from one climate and like put it in the opposite climate. So for a common garden experiment, this would be a case where you take, let's use the crickets again. You take northern crickets and you take southern crickets and you put them both in one condition. So maybe you put them both in central conditions, or maybe you put them both in southern conditions, or maybe you put them both in northern conditions. So common garden, it means that you put them all in the same space. And so then you could still test this idea about whether or not those life history traits are genetically fixed or they're plastic. Because in a common garden experiment, you might have the control and the treatment happening in one set of conditions. I hope that makes sense. But it's common garden means you bring all of the individuals that you're experimenting on into a single situation. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so tell me again, under what environmental scenarios do you have R selection? Oh, sorry, Brooke asked a question there. Do domestic animals or humans kind of break this finite energy rule? Gosh, I'm not sure how we could, not sure how to answer that. I mean, humans even still have finite, and like, I guess it's a bit of a semantic argument about how you define finite. And I was trying to say this when I answered Cameron's question, that it sort of kind of has to do with the snapshot maybe that you're looking at now. And I'm not sure if I'm answering this totally appropriately. So, even if a human is consuming and go to the grocery store and buy all kinds of food, we still have that amount of energy that we have at that given moment that has to be partitioned among the things that we're using. And I think, again, it maybe speaks to the idea that our pie just gets bigger because we can consume endlessly, it almost seems. But there's still, so a bigger pie, but then still within that pie, there's still a partitioning of energy. I hope that answers that. That helps a lot. Okay, good. All right, any other questions about life history stuff? I have a couple more minutes. Okay, nice seeing none. Hope you guys have a great afternoon, and I'll see you again on Thursday.
Thanks, Jackie. Have a good week.
Yeah, see you guys.
Thank you very much. Have yourself a lovely day.
Yeah. Yes, Adam, I can stay on to talk to you afterwards.
Sorry, one quick question. I don't know if I missed it. Do we have a lab today?
No, we don't.
No, okay. Thank you.
Just wait for other folks to sign out here, Adam. Or maybe I can be able to sign them out myself.